Hey guys, my name is Gabby. Welcome back to my channel, and today we're going to be doing some horror book recommendations. And this is a video that I've been wanting to do for a very long time as I've been getting more into horror books recently. But I feel like I've finally read enough horror that I can actually compile a list of some of my favorites together to recommend. And maybe you can pile some of these up and save them for the fall time and for like Halloween time if you really just want to read horror at that time of year. I get it, but I would say these books are great to read at any time of year. They will spook you no matter what. So to begin, we're going to start with probably my favorite book on this whole list, and that is The Troop by Nick Cutter. And this one is so freaking creepy. It's probably the scariest book that I've ever read, but maybe not in the way that you might think, because this book involves a lot of body horror and a lot of something is under your skin kind of vibes that is just very scary. This book follows this group of boys who are going into the Canadian wilderness on this island, and they're all like kind of like Boy Scouts, and while they're on the island, this dude stumbles onto the island on this boat, and he's like, please feed me, I'm so hungry. And he starts like shoveling dirt into his mouth, acting very, very strangely. And then things go south for them after they start interacting with this man. I will say, I don't know if right now during a pandemic is the best time to read this book because wow. But I personally read it during the pandemic in these last few months, and I just absolutely loved it. I've never been more scared from a horror novel because this book is just the exact kind of horror that scares me. And I will warn you that there is some heavy animal abuse scenes in this book, so if that is very triggering for you, then I would maybe avoid this one. But oh my god, this book is terrifying, and I'm kind of obsessed with it. Like, it might be my favorite book of the year. I don't know. Another horror novel that's kind of like horror slash thriller that's also one of my all-time favorites is The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. This one can be seen as more of a thriller, I guess, but it is very horror as well. Like, there's some very horrific aspects of this story. And this story follows this gay couple, Eric and Andrew, and their adopted daughter, Wen, when they go to their cabin that's out in the woods. And these four people stumble upon their cabin, and it's kind of like a home invasion story. They're trying to break into the house, and they're saying that if they don't help them with something, it's gonna be the end of the world, and that if they do this very horrific thing, they can prevent the apocalypse. This book gave me the most anxiety I think that a book has ever given me before because of the whole idea of like the home invasion. It was just very intense constantly, and I would be like reading this and I would hear like a sound in the other room and I would just like fucking snap because I'm like, holy shit, what? It's just very scary, very intense, and the ending of this book is one of my all-time favorites, and it's just so good. One of the horror novels that kind of like got me into horror a while ago is probably Bird Box by Josh Malerman. I think this is one of the first horror books that I read as an adult, and I just really enjoyed this one. I feel like this is one of those horror starter kit kind of novels because I feel like if you're into horror, then Bird Box is definitely usually one of the first books that people tend to gravitate towards, especially since the movie came out and the movie was so popular. But honestly, even if you have seen the movie, the book is way better, okay? So read the book. And this story takes place in an apocalyptic world where the world has been taken over by something. We don't really know what, but all we do know is that when you see it, you go batshit insane. And so in this world, it's kind of like A Quiet Place, but instead of hearing, it's sight. And so in this world, our main characters are wearing blindfolds over their eyes to protect them from seeing what they don't know, what's out there. And the thing I love about this book, and the thing that's the most scary about this book, is the fact that the readers feel blindfolded too, because we don't know what they're afraid of. Like, is it people? Is it a monster? Is it something in the air that's just like, I don't know, you don't know what it is? And I think that's the scariest thing, and it kind of has this play on like a fear of the unknown. That's the most scary thing, you know what I mean? Bird Box is just great. I love it so much. Another really great book by Josh Malerman as well is A House at the Bottom of a Lake. This one is a novella. It's only like 100 pages, and this is also one of my favorite horror novels of all time because it's so freaking atmospheric and creepy and weird. And this one follows these two 17-year-old teenagers who are going on this date, and while they're out on the lake, they discover a house sitting on the bottom of the lake, and then they start to explore the house. It's just very weird, very eerie. The vibes of this book are just, oh my gosh, like if you have a fear of like drowning, you know, or like being underwater and being claustrophobic and like being held underwater. Like, holy shit, dude, this book is terrifying. And this book also has one of those endings where you're just like, wait, what? And even though it's only 100 pages, like this book packs so much intenseness into those 100 pages. So because this is a horror recommendations video, I do feel like I need to mention some Stephen King picks because I have read quite a bit of Stephen King's horror novels in this last year. My personal favorite is Pet Sematary. Pet Sematary is the only 5-star book I've given to Stephen King, and Pet Sematary is great because it really plays on your real life fears, because this story is about this family who moves into this new house, and behind their house is this pet cemetery where pets are buried, and then some weird shit starts happening with their pets. But honestly, the way that this book talks about grief and death and like the realness of those things, it is honestly terrifying, and it's like a real life terrible crazy horror shit, you know what I mean? But some other Stephen King books that I would still recommend is The Shining. The Shining is such a classic. If you haven't read The Shining, it's just so good. I personally am probably a bigger fan of the movie The Shining, which I know is like a super unpopular opinion, but I love The Shining. The story's great. If you didn't know, it's about this guy, Jack Torrance, who takes his family to the Overlook Hotel, and they have to stay at the Overlook Hotel to watch over the hotel for like 5 or 6 months because there's major snowstorms in Colorado and somebody needs to watch the hotel. So they're basically like hotel sitters. And The Shining is another one of those horror novels that I feel like has a lot of real life horror in it, because it's really about a fear of like a parent hurting you, and especially an alcoholic crazy parent hurting you. And I would also recommend It and Salem's Lot, even though I know It is like literally the longest book ever. I think this is the longest book that I've ever read, but It is just so spooky. It has this really great atmosphere in this book, and this book is about Pennywise the clown, if you didn't know. And then Salem's Lot, this one is a lot shorter of a book for Stephen King. It's only about 600 pages, but this one is also really great. This one has like a vampire vibe. It also kind of has like a Haunting of Hill House vibe to it because it involves this Marston house that is haunted. And yeah, this one was a whole lot of fun. This one had the best like spooky atmosphere to it. Oh my gosh, it was just a whole lot of fun. But again, Pet Sematary is still my favorite Stephen King, and it's great because this one is shorter. It's like less than 400 pages. So this is a good one. Read Pet Sematary if you're going to check out Stephen King. One horror book that I read at the end of last year was Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky, and this book completely took me by surprise with how much I loved it. This book is over 700 pages. It's freaking massive, but honestly, it's so good. And this book is about this little boy named Christopher who has an imaginary best friend, and he goes into the woods for like a few days, I want to say, and he's like missing, and then he returns and he's different. Everything about him is different, and he's really smart all of a sudden. And this book is just so creepy. It's so good, and you can so tell that this book is inspired by a lot of Stephen King's old 80s stuff, and it's also very inspired by Stranger Things, I want to say, because it's very similar to Stranger Things, I feel like. And I will say the first 500 pages of this book are where the money's at. Like, the first 500 pages of this book are amazing, god tier 5 stars, and then like the last 200 pages are like meh. It might bring your rating down a little bit, not gonna lie. But either way, I would still highly recommend this book just because of those first 500 pages. Like, they're so scary and so good. One horror book that I read earlier this year that really surprised the hell out of me was Bunny by Mona Awad. And this one is one of those horror novels that like I wouldn't just go around recommending this to anyone, because this book is very weird. It's probably the weirdest horror book on this whole list, and I kind of feel like this book almost feels like literary fiction at times or something like that, just because it's written so beautifully, but it's also just so weird. The best way I know how to explain if you're gonna enjoy this book or not is to compare it to the movies Mean Girls and Sorry to Bother You. And I know that that sounds like a very weird mix of things, but I feel like if you enjoyed Mean Girls and or Sorry to Bother You, then you would enjoy this book, because a lot of people I've seen describe this book as Mean Girls but written by Stephen King on acid. and I feel like that's an accurate explanation of this book, because this book is terrifying and it's weird, but it's just written so well and it's so creepy, and I just love everything about this one. Another horror novel that I just read earlier this year is The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix, and this is actually the first Grady Hendrix novel that I've read so far. I do have plans to read more of his stuff soon, but this one was really fun. It's really creepy. It has to deal with vampires and a book club in the 90s. And it basically just follows this group of moms who were all a part of this book club, and then this dude, James, this vampire, comes into their town and joins their book club, and things just get very weird. And this book just had all of the vampire fun. I'm not usually a major fan of reading about vampires, but I feel like this book and Salem's Lot are both the most fun I've had with like vampire related content in books recently. But this one was very fun to read. This one had a lot of different scenes that were so graphic and detailed that they're just burned into my brain forever. Then the last one that I have on this list is kind of also a horror slash thriller book, but it's Home Before Dark by Riley Sager. This book, like, yeah, while it is kind of like thriller, it's also very horror. Like, this one has a lot of horror elements to it, because this book is about this girl, Maggie. When she was a kid, she grew up in this house that was maybe haunted, and her dad ended up writing a very successful book about the house that they grew up in called House of Horrors. Now it takes place in the future when she's an adult, and her dad has recently passed away, and so now she's inheriting the house. So she's going back to the house to try and like get it ready to sell, but then she realizes maybe her dad wasn't so crazy after all, and maybe this house might actually be haunted. And this book was so good. It was so much fun. It's very Haunting of Hill House vibes, and I honestly feel like the first half of this book feels just like horror. It doesn't even really feel like a thriller to me until like closer to the end of this book, but the beginning of this feels just like an amazing creepy horror novel, and I lived for it. I just very recently did an entire reading vlog dedicated to reading this book, so I will link that down below as well. This was such a good horror thriller vibe kind of book. Oh my gosh. Alright, so those are all of the horror novels that I have to recommend to you today. I feel like I've just had so much fun recently getting into horror novels, and I'm so glad earlier this year I decided to do that video of reading 3 hyped horror novels, because it really introduced me to so many different horror books, and it's made me kind of like get out of my comfort zone, because I've always like loved horror, I guess, but I just never knew what kind of horror to read. Like, I don't know, I feel like it's one of those genres that people just don't talk about a whole lot. At least I don't see it talked about a lot on booktube and just like around in the world, and I'm just so excited that I'm finally getting into more horror. So I will please ask for any recommendations. Please give me horror book recommendations, and who knows, maybe for my next reading 3 horror books kind of video that I do, maybe I'll pick some books from the comment section if you guys can recommend me some good ones that sound interesting. I'm really excited about it, so let me know what your thoughts are on any of these horror books that I just mentioned, and if they're also some of your favorites. That is all for now, so thank you guys so much for watching as always, and I will see you very soon with a new video. Bye!